Before I start, I would like to give you my disclaimer. I am not an employee of this church, nor am I an officer. I am merely an invited guest to speak. My views are strictly my own views and do not reflect the views of this church necessarily. There was a time in our fragile human history when the church ruled the world. This was a time of intellectual stagnation, rampant superstition, and suppression of reason. This period of time was known as the Dark Ages. It must have seemed hopeless to thoughtful people. They must have felt like they were standing in a great abyss, helpless to bring about any change, to make things better. Perhaps sometimes they were sensing that all was lost. Some people share that same feeling today. During the Dark Ages, scientists and philosophers were forced to publish their findings under assumed names for fear of ostracism, excommunication, and even execution. Then, in the darkest hours, came a breeze. It was gentle at first, then it had increasing power, and it brought forth the Renaissance. Imagine from that black, dark void came great souls like Leonardo da Vinci, Copernicus, Michelangelo, Montaigne, Cervantes, El Greco, Francis Bacon, Galileo, Shakespeare. Under the deepest human oppression lies the human will to kick off the traces and be free. Human thought, reason, and logic will never be held down for very long, because something will always awaken it, and we will move forward again. The human migration towards a higher consciousness will never be arrested by archaic, stagnating forces. Eyes Wide Open reveals that we are in a time of distress. Never before in any of our lifetimes have we seen the radical, delusional fringe of society move into the mainstream. We have seen the delusionally guided move from the edges of society, where they were practically in positions to be laughed at, move into power in this country. They have moved into local governments, state governments, even into the chambers of Congress, even into the White House. Reason has a knife at its throat, and the thugs with the knife are motivated by religious ideology and political power. It appears that we stand at the threshold of a second dark age. Reason and rationality are once again threatened by superstition and a belief in the supernatural. All of the things that have really made us great as a species are being ignored. The signposts that have guided our path are ridiculed, and we are asked to accept fantasy for fact. We seem confronted in every direction. There are extremely vocal forces pushing us to reinsert prayer into schools and sporting events. There are those who would reverse Roe versus Wade. Civil liberties are gravely threatened, not by outside forces, but by extremists within. History is being falsely rewritten to support the notion that this is a Christian nation. Science is being questioned. Ideas like evolution are being questioned and being proposed as being a mere theory unsupported by fact. There are efforts to impose a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage. Now, this really must be very homophobic, that we need to change our Constitution. There are legislators who would have the government view homosexuality as an unforgivable sin. The war in Iraq is being justified by some people as being the beginning of Armageddon and necessary to bring about God's kingdom. Faith-based initiatives, though shown to be no more effective than traditional programs and much more vulnerable to abuses, are being pushed down our throat. The Ten Commandments will be on every government building if the religious right has its way. The Jones Bill, which is House of Representatives Bill 235, would allow organizations and religious leaders to endorse political candidates from the pulpit. Religious ideology appears to be a particular criterion for judicial nominations. The government can now intrude into any household for surveillance under the Patriot Act, and this seems to particularly apply to the homes of American Muslims. The last election was touted as a win for moral values. But moral values are not hot-button issues, personal preferences, or religious ideologies. Moral values are issues like life versus death, war versus peace, hunger versus full bellies, education versus ignorance, equal rights, equal opportunities, social justice, and individual freedoms. I don't mean this as a political comment, but more about a comment on the separation of church and state. There must be a lot of very thoughtful people who feel that their political party has been kidnapped by the religious right. The Republican Party was once the bastion of libertarianism, has now become the party of religious, nosy busybodies. The Democratic Party has become more weak-spirited, and it has its share of hopefuls and hacks who want to capture the religious right vote. As Bill Moyer says, and I quote, "It is no wonder that Karl Rove goes around the White House whistling that militant hymn, 'Onward, Christian Soldiers,'" close quote. Most of the antics that we observe, if they were not so funny, they would be terrifying. But they are funny. Focus on the Family founder, James C. Dobson, highlights this list of religious clowns with his attack on no less than SpongeBob. Yes, the lovable little creature that lives under a pineapple in the sea is right in the gun sights of James Dobson. He has been accused, SpongeBob that is, has been accused of making a cartoon video promoting tolerance. Can you imagine who would dare promote tolerance? We might all get along. I suppose I would classify this particular case as a case of SpongeBob versus Sponge Brain. I suppose Dobson felt like that he had to do something. After all, he could not be outdone by the Most Reverend Jerry Falwell, who had previously attacked Teletubby. Yes, this little purse-toting, asexual cartoon character was labeled by Falwell as gay. He was a certified girly man puppet thing. To me, this sounds like a case of Teletubby versus Tubby Fellow. Not surprisingly, the insanity doesn't stop there. Our newly appointed Education Secretary, Margaret Spelling, had to exercise her new politico-religious muscle. Margaret Spelling, informed Public Broadcasting System, PBS, that they had better not air the popular children's program Postcards from Buster. You see, Buster is this little animated bunny who travels around the country with his father, meeting new children, seeing new cultures, customs, and different foods. In Spelling's opinion, one particular program was promoting a homosexual lifestyle when one girl on the program mentioned that she had a mother and a stepmother and she loved them both. Should we spell it out for spelling? Okay, you're a paranoid religious busybody, Margaret. Right-wing fanatics have been oozing out of the closet with more frequency since James Watts, Ronald Reagan's first Secretary of the Interior, made the outrageous statement, and I quote, "After the last tree is felled, Christ will come back." Close quote. He was appointed to protect the interior. Go figure. I suppose he emboldened others by his delusional statement. Changing the direction, but not changing the topic. Did you know that the Vatican actually had the gall to ask Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to have the United States government block the sexual abuse cases of clergy filed in Kentucky? Condoleezza Rice wouldn't even touch that hot potato. Is it possible that the wall between church and state is getting squeezed? There are some occasional bright spots in all of this muddle-headed nonsense. The Reverend Graylan Hagler of Plymouth Congregational Church, when asked about faith-based programs, he had this to say, and I quote, "When you take money from the Pharaoh, you end up having to kiss the Pharaoh's behind," close quote. It is not surprising to me when I read that about 100 years ago, two less than scholarly immigrant preachers concocted this wild story from disparate passages in the Bible. It was a bizarre story. What is amazing to me is that even in the 21st century, there are Americans who actually believe that fantastical tale. There are millions of people who believe in the rapture. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but there is actually a rapture index. And every year we can see the rapture index go up. It's now at 144, and it's closing the gap. So it's about to take place. When the rapture begins, people will be lifted out of their cars, their planes, their houses, restaurants, yes, even out of their very own underwear, and transported to heaven. This will leave the rest of us non-believers here on earth to suffer plagues, boils, locusts, and frogs. It has been a long time since we have been attacked by frogs, but they're coming. Another phenomena that we have all observed is the megachurch. While most church denominations are losing people, megachurches are growing at a rapid pace. In 1970, there were 10 non-Catholic megachurches. Now there are 282. Unlike traditional churches, they offer religious rock and roll music, self-helpish sermons, athletic facilities, childcare, marriage counseling, AA meetings, financial planning, 50,000 square foot buildings, Hawaiian-shirted ministers who preach with terms like, "Hey, dude," and donuts. Boy, do they have donuts. One church alone reports that its Krispy Kreme budget annually is $14,000. The simple fact is megachurches aren't new. We had a whole burst of megachurches in the early 80s, and they peaked and they kind of went down. You know, this is just a new packaging of an old idea. It's less formal, more active, larger buildings, and much, much slicker advertising and public relations. But like most new products, the luster will fade, and then we'll see some enterprising young evangelical who will repackage it, and it'll come out a different way. You may be thinking by now, What does this have to do with our finest hour? It looks kind of bleak. It may look like our worst hour. Jane is thinking, when are you going to shut up? Well, it's simple. We are human beings, and we are marching towards an uncertain evolution driven by curiosity, evolving intellect, and even higher purpose. This giant leap backwards that we are watching is just a bump in the cosmic road. Intellect and reason will always triumph over irrationality, fear, and superstition. We have to remember that this is America. And we don't bother to put a stoplight up at the corner until umpteen people have been killed. It takes something to wake us up, to marshal our will so that we can move on. People of reason have been eerily silent during this theocratic movement, but I think they are beginning to wake up. They're beginning to question some of the things that they have let slide. You know, reason is this great sleeping giant. But once it is awakened, it is an incredibly powerful force. Humanity has always had its hard times, but we have always had great souls to remind us of our destiny, to lead us towards a more humane society. Names like Socrates, Thomas Paine, Bertrand Russell. You know, our leaders sometimes have to take us where we're afraid to go. We didn't want to break away from England, but people like our founding fathers led us to independence. Some people were afraid to give up slavery, but, you know, Lincoln took us through it. We were afraid of civil rights, but Kennedy and Johnson took us by the hand and led us there. We still have a lot more to do, and we'll get it done. But we have to remember that philosophers and leaders throughout all of history have always gotten in trouble by questioning religious truths. But it is because of their steadfast courage that we are moving beyond religious ideology and beyond anthropomorphic gods. These are uneasy times. We have economic uncertainty. We've got 2 wars going on at the same time. Social Security's status quo is threatened. Bitter congressional disputes, corporate chicanery, a looming oil crisis, and a very long list of emotional opportunists waiting to take advantage of the weak and fearful. So naturally, we can expect some kind of religious revival, but this does not mean an end to science and reason. As a species, our finest hour will come when we can finally allow academia, government, and science to proceed without church involvement or interference, and at the same time permit all religions to go about their business without governmental interference or control. This newest resurgence of theocratic power, both in the U.S. Christian population and in the worldwide Islamic population, gives reason to concern. But both would seek to establish a theocratic government based on fundamentalism. If this is allowed to happen, issues like abortion rights, stem cell research, environmental concerns, social welfare, women's rights, sexual orientation, individual liberties would all be in jeopardy. Our finest hour will be when we stand up for equity and justice for all people on this planet. Reason and logic would dictate that we cannot allow dogma, fear, and mysticism to undermine the level of enlightenment we share today. Superstition over reason, supernaturalism over science will only ensure a world with more hatred, dogmatism, and fear of the unknown. Human potential is greater than any anthropomorphic god we could invent, and our finest hour will be when we exercise that potential. The alarm has sounded, and we must take courage. We must stand forthright against the agents that would push us back into a dark age. I do not propose a revolution, but a new renaissance. I do not suggest we prepare for battle, but I suggest we wake up. If we do, this will be our finest hour for the millionth time in our scrappy human history. Thank you.